Welcome to East Coast Winemaking, the podcast that brings professional winemaking experience from popular wine regions on the East Coast of the United States to wherever you are. I'm your host, John Monier. I'm a Finger Lakes winemaker, and I'm excited to provide easy access to educational and entertaining interviews with other winemakers and industry professionals. In each episode, we'll cover the background and unique perspective of my guest on how they approach the craft of winemaking. I'm excited for the opportunity to learn from seasoned wine pros and hope these interviews can be informative to both colleagues in the industry as well as relative newcomers. Feel free to email questions or comments to eastcoastwinemaking@gmail.com and follow us at East Coast Winemaking on Instagram to be notified when new episodes come out. If you're interested in checking out my wine called John Albert, you can find info on that at johnalbertwine.com. Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 7 of East Coast Winemaking. Today I'm bringing you an interview with my friend Lynne Fahy. She's a very capable Finger Lakes winemaker. She's currently working at a winery where they only produce Riesling, which gives her a very unique perspective. We talk about some of her winemaking practices, some interesting things about their estate vineyard, and some big picture wine stuff in general. I had a great time talking with Lynne, and I hope y'all enjoy that I had the conversation with her as well. Did that make sense? You get what I'm saying. Enjoy the conversation I had with Lynne. Lynne, thank you so much for joining me and being on my podcast. Actually, I was thinking about this today. Before I started doing any of the podcasts, I wrote a list of winemakers in the region that maybe I would have access to speak with them about it. And you were like in the first 3 or 5 names that I wrote down. Honored. And this is only episode 7, but I've already gone, I've made this roundabout way to finally talking with you. Yeah. But the fact that now we're actually finding time to sit down and talk feels like, in some ways, it's a long time coming.
yeah. I'm kind of waiting to be asked, to be honest. I was like, is he going to ever ask me?
I know. I can't justify the way that my brain worked. I had never really met Ian Barry, but for some reason, he was at the top of my list too. And anyway, the other thing that I'll just start by saying off the bat is I'm excited to speak with you, both because I've known you a long time, and I know that you have interesting, you're a smart winemaker and you have interesting opinions. And I think that winemaking talk with you is interesting and educational, but you're also in a unique circumstance because the winery where you work now, which maybe we'll go back and talk about how you got there and all that beforehand, but the winery that you're at now only makes Riesling. Yeah. And I think that is both from a winemaking perspective unique, but also considering that Riesling is the kind of de facto variety of the Finger Lakes, puts you in a very unique position to speak about your experience. So anyway, I'm getting way ahead of myself. So Lynne Fahy, head winemaker, is that what you would say your title is? Head winemaker?
Yeah, and general manager.
At Hillick and Hobbs Winery, which is located in Burdett, which is, I looked it up on a map, on the east side of Seneca Lake, kind of way down at the south, right?
Yeah, just north of Watkinsglen on the east side.
Okay. And I'm trying to remember, is your production there as well, or is that just where the vineyard and
That's
the tasting room is?
That's just where the vineyard and tasting room is,
okay.
Yeah.
Not that maybe it would necessarily matter to people who come visit, because it's not often that people are in the winery.
They think of our farm center at the north end as the winery, and I'm like, no, that's for tractors.
Okay, so before we get into any nitty-gritty winemaking stuff, please start at the beginning of your story, where the initial interest in wine production began and all the important steps that got you where you are now.
Yeah, I kind of always joke that beer got me into wine. I love beer, still do. But when I was in college, I was working maybe 3 jobs at the time in the service industry to save money to travel. And I ended up working at a couple of unique places, but one was a kind of tavern-like place that had 40 rotating taps of beer. And so The food menu was a little less exciting, but the beer menu was very interesting, especially given the location of this restaurant. But so we were constantly tasting beer, and it was the first time I was like, oh, all these things taste different, and there's different reasons for the styles and where they come from. And that was like my first introduction to like tasting anything. And then I was also working at this cafe that was well known for like pastries and actually like cupcakes. Like that was one of their claims to fame. And so I got kind of interested in like patisserie, and just like I was in college, I'd go home on the weekends and like bake a bunch, like cupcakes and cakes and cookies, and just experimenting in the kitchen. And, and so I was like, oh, maybe I'll get into like something culinary. Now I was at the time studying pre-physical therapy and exercise science. And
really?
Yeah.
Where were you studying?
In Baldwin Wallace University in Cleveland, or just outside of Cleveland. And I wasn't sure, by the time I was, getting towards graduation, I wasn't sure that that's what I wanted to do. The idea of kind of being in a clinical setting, in an office, became less and less appealing. But I applied to grad school, and I applied to one grad school in Scotland because it was the only internationally accredited university that like I could go get my degree and come back and practice. It was a free application. I didn't have to take the GED, and I was like, well, if I get in, like then it's fate. I'm going to go be a physical therapist. Well, I got in, and
that's not where I was expecting the story to go.
Yeah, so I got in, and I was like, oh, okay, I guess I'm going to grad school. And, but the semester started, the following January. So I graduated in May, and then I would have, whatever that is, 6-8 months before I had to start graduate school. And then I got the bill and in the mail, and I was like, oh, this is expensive for something I don't know I want to do. And so I deferred for a year, but I'd kind of planned I was going to go travel and then end up in Scotland. That was like the grand plan. And I was like, maybe I'll work at a brewery and try to think about like beer making. But though I had no idea, like I didn't know what fermentation was necessarily at that point, but I was like, beer's cool, and there's breweries in Scotland, and maybe I'll work for a year and feel it out. But I ended up in Thailand, and when I was traveling, and I just met this guy in a hostel, and we were chatting, and he's like, well, what would you want to do if you don't do physical therapy? And I was like, I don't know, like beer, maybe. And he's like, well, I work in wine in Australia, and I work harvest, I get paid pretty well, and then I go travel, and it's really fun, it's interesting, and it's fermentation. And he was like, harvest is coming up, you should, if you have time, you should just go and do one and see. And so he gave me some websites, and I applied to positions I was not qualified for, but everything. I just applied for everything. I was like, harvest assistant winemaker. I was like, I can assist a winemaker, sure. No experience, no idea. And I ended up getting a job in New Zealand, working for a 14,000 ton facility in Blenheim in Marlborough. And when I was there, I always joked that it was like summer camp for adults. We had 70 temporary harvest employees during the day and 70 at night. So there was like 140 people from all over the world that worked at this facility. I was in the day shift. I worked with primarily Pinot Noir, actually, and red wine. But because of that, I got to do a little bit of everything. And I just loved, like, I was outside all the time. I was moving around. It was like very physical work. People seemed to like what they were doing. So instead of going to Scotland, after that, I applied for jobs in the West Coast of the US and got a job in Oregon. Because everyone was saying that, if you think you want to do this as a job, you kind of have to keep the momentum going. And so the next thing was, and I thought I would travel for a while. And
that's interesting. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know that that's necessarily true now, but when I was there, that's what they're like, you should get ready to apply for your next harvest. Like, keep it going. And so I ended up, the first place I interviewed for was Tradent Winery in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. And So I ended up going there for harvest and then being asked to stay on a little bit longer. And then maybe a couple months later, a position opened up and I was able to start working there full time. And I was there for 3 years or just under, working primarily with Pinot Noir and Riesling. We made up to 11 different Rieslings every year.
Whoa.
Yeah. So a lot of micro winemaking happening there.
That's the question that goes through my mind is this experience at Tresatum. How does the volume compare to your first experience? Did you say in Marlborough?
Yeah. I mean, so opposite. I don't remember so I went to Oregon in 2014. It was the largest harvest they had. I don't know on record, but it was very big. And I don't remember how many tons we did, but, it equated to, I think, around 10,000 cases. So whatever that math is.
Yeah.
And, compared to 14,000 tons. And in my section in New Zealand, we did 2,000 tons.
Damn.
Oh,
14,000 tons is crazy.
It's great. I mean, and what I actually really value, I'm glad that was my first harvest. I don't think I'd want to work in that setting all the time, but it taught me the value of logistics and efficiency, and to see wine being made at that scale was fascinating. Yeah,
it's really interesting. Is that winery in Marlborough the kind of place that has that the press pad in the facility runs 24/7?
24 hours.
There's multiple shifts that cover. People are working all the time.
Yeah, we had 2 shifts, 2 12-hour shifts, and there was 20 presses. So
that's all you need to say in regards to how much of production this place does.
So in my section we had 5 I think 10-ton presses, and then there was 2 other quarters that had 5 10-ton presses, and then the other one, quarter 4, which was all outside, had I think 3 10-ton presses and 2 30-ton presses.
Wow.
Yeah. So you get literally dump trucks full of grapes.
That's insane.
Yeah. It's really cool. But it's just massive. Yeah.
I've never had an experience like that, and I can kind of imagine. I know a number of our colleagues have had similar experiences. Yeah. It sounds it's still winemaking, but in some ways it feels hard to compare to the life that we live in the Finger Lakes.
Especially now. I work last year. I think we picked. What was it?
Sorry to interrupt you. I'm just going to move this a little bit more in front of you.
I think last year we picked 38 tons. So how
many?
38 maybe.
38?
Yeah. I know. So you're just
that's even a little bit smaller than I would have assumed.
Yeah, we're working on gaining some volume.
Sure.
Yeah. But I think at Tresatum in my mind I have around 200 tons, but we were also not only making wine, for Tresatum, but at the time, Louis Jadot had started their resonance project in Oregon, and they were using Tresatum as their facility. So we were making some, doing the work for them as well. But yeah, it was that 2014 was a big year. But the thing that was so fascinating to me when I got there, again, second harvest, I know nothing about wine, and I've only had one experience in a winery. And I was like, why does everything move? I was like, the tanks move, the barrels are moving. I was like, everything just moving all the time. And I was like, no. A tank, it stays. You don't, you move the wine, you don't move the tank. But, we were just bringing things in and out of the winery all the time, and, really making the space work for what we needed to use it for. Not necessarily, it was more multi-purpose than, you have these big wineries where it's just halls of tanks, and they just, nothing moves. The pump moves. That's it.
Even in my experience, the thought of tanks moving is something that would surprise me to see.
Yeah.
But it must have been for logistical purposes.
And to
based
be able,
on the space that they had available.
And red fermenters, all of them could be moved in and out. So sometimes we would, and all the glycol system there was on quick connect. So we could kind of hook up kind of different types of tanks depending if we needed to use the chilling system. But yeah, so the fermenters would kind of move around. We'd take them out to clean them, put them back in. Yeah. I remember being like, no, that's not how this works. Like,
that's a really funny thought. Tanks don't move.
Tanks don't move. Like,
I would take that for granted now too.
Yeah. We moved them. We moved so many things all the time. I really honed in my forklifting skills when I worked there.
So Trisatum.
Yeah. So Trisatum, was there for a few years, loved it, great people, and I really liked the work that we were doing. But Oregon in general was getting like very big. And like the way that Portland was growing, things were getting expensive. So, the wine industry isn't the most lucrative business to be in. And, when you're looking at cost of houses and like where things are going, it just felt impossible. And so I started looking at other wine regions, and looking in the East, they're smaller, newer, well, not newer necessarily, but like still kind of coming up in the national wine scene in terms of like popularity. And then looking at real estate and, I resisted New York for a really long time because I grew up here. So, and I worked very hard in high school to leave. So
that was my next question was what brought you back to the East Coast, knowing that you grew up around here? It's interesting to hear. I'm not surprised. I think it's a lot of people's feelings as well. That they don't feel called back to the place where they grew up. It's just an unfortunate circumstance, maybe in your case, that you happen to grow up near one of the biggest wine regions on the East Coast.
Yeah. And I think I didn't, because I grew up closer to Rochester. So there, I knew the Finger Lakes there was wine being made down here. And even when I was in New Zealand, someone was like, oh yeah, Finger Lakes, that's, Riesling. And I was like, you know where that is? There's a place in New York called the Finger Lakes. But when I was in Oregon, I'd come back for Christmas one year and I was like, I really want to try some wines. It'd be a shame not to, especially because I was in Oregon. The longer I worked there, the more interested I became working with Riesling over working with Pinot Noir. I like the expression. I like the different things that you could do with it and kind of how it showed like the terroir of the different vineyards that we worked with. So I was really fascinated to try Rieslings here. And I went to I went to Billsboro and Red Tail Ridge and Herman J. Weimer. And I was pretty impressed with the wines. I don't know what I was expecting necessarily, but I was like, the quality is really high. These Rieslings are interesting. But then, I initially was looking at moving to Michigan. But turns out it's not that affordable there either.
I've heard that's the case.
Yeah.
Same with some of the wine region in Virginia. I've heard the same thing. Yeah. And it's like Traverse City is beautiful and it's a really nice area, but realistically, and then, I kept falling on like Geneva and I kept like looking in Geneva and I was like, oh, the wines are good and it's affordable. And it's Riesling. So it kind of all was like, I made the decision and I moved here, without a job. 'Cause it's maybe changed a little bit, but I think it's actually quite it's very similar still now that, the production jobs in the Finger Lakes, it's a lot of, kind of, word of mouth, when positions become open. Yep. And so I didn't, I was applying for jobs or like reaching out to people, but there wasn't anything available. And then that's when I met you. So I applied for a job at Ravine's and in the tasting room.
In the tasting room. Yeah. So, Lisa hired me as the assistant manager and that was a wild ride. Managing an event space and weddings and rehearsal dinners and hosting dinners and managing a staff of 20-ish people and lots of activity. Mm-hmm. But, that didn't really feel like my calling, as much fun as it sometimes was.
I think most winemakers excuse me, most winemakers that I know are like very definitively back of house people. Yeah, it's almost like talking with people who are really like into, cooking or something like that as a professional. Yeah. And it's a rare breed, I think, that is both interested in doing the fraternizing with the customers
Yeah.
and making the wine. So it's funny when you hear winemakers that have had experiences where maybe they needed to have their arm twisted, but they worked a front of house job, and how they relate to it in comparison to something like working in the cellar.
Yeah. And I think, well, for me, you know, it taught me a lot. And I'd worked a little bit in the tasting room at Trusadum, so I'd been familiar with, you know, operations and, you know, selling wine to customers and interacting with customers. And I actually get a lot of enjoyment out of it, especially when you are, like, sometimes I'll be in the tasting room at Hillick and Hobbs and people don't know who I am. And it's fun to be able to engage with people about something that like you're making or that like you're involved in, and educate and get to know them and why they're there. And either like, you know, some people, they come in and do a tasting and they may not think they love Riesling, or they have an idea in their head of what Riesling is. And then when you can kind of see them change their mind or like have an opinion or learn something, that's like exciting and fun. And, you know, people in general, people coming to tasting rooms are like trying to have a good time, you know, and it's like, that's good energy to be around. But yeah, Ravines was busy. I mean, and we saw a lot of people and did a lot of things. And just being able to work on like coordinating that and the logistics and staffing. I was 26 or 27 when I had that job, which now feels like I was a baby. When I was like telling all these people what they should be doing.
It feels like a long time ago for me too.
It feels like, it does. A different lifetime. But when I was there, a position at Anthony Road came up for an assistant winemaking role. And I was like, you know, this is a good opportunity. Like I love production. I love the movement. I love the education and learning. And, and so I was ready to get back into the cellar.
I didn't think about how full circle this was going to be, because I'll just mention now that the winemaker at Anthony Road, Peter Beecraft, I already interviewed.
Yeah.
And so if anybody listening hasn't already listened to that episode with Peter Beecraft, go back and listen to it, because he's a super smart and interesting guy.
Yeah. And Peter and I clicked immediately. And he was so fun to work with and so willing to let me make decisions or try anything I wanted, like give me little small batch projects I could work on, and open to feedback. And, and we really just had a great rhythm of working. And it was fun. And the Martini family over at Anthony Road are the best. They're just the kindest, most welcoming people. Yeah,
the environment at Anthony Road, between Peter Beecraft being the winemaker and the Martini family that own the business, is second to none.
Yeah, it's very unique environment. And, you know, I didn't even really want to like leave. Like Peter kind of had to kick me out the door a little bit, because, so that, you know, August Imel, he was the winemaker at Cuca Spring at the time, and he left me, I was out for a run and he left me a voicemail on my phone saying, you know, I'd like to, if you could just give me a call back, there's something I want to talk to you about. I remember thinking like, well, what could that be?
Wait, while I'm thinking about it, let me just put this into time perspective. What year were you working at Anthony Road?
I started there in 2018.
Okay.
And
worked 1 year.
No, I was there for about 2.5 years.
Okay. Before you got this call from August.
Yeah. Before I got this call from August. And that was a great thing about Anthony Road, you know, and all just, they're very connected to the community. And so I was able to meet a lot of people, through being there. And yeah, so I'd known August, you know, through the industry and whatever. And he'd called me and was like, you know, I'm taking a job at Gallo. Do you think you'd want to be the winemaker for Cuca Spring? And I was like, can I call you back? Because I wasn't sure. You know, it was a weird, I you know, when you're moving up through the cellar and assistant winemaker and kind of learning, I don't know when you think, you know, you're ready to be a winemaker, or, you know, what that opportunity is going to be like. And I really loved Anthony Road. Like I liked being there. I liked working with Peter. I liked the wines that we were making. And so I was talking to Peter about it, and he's like, you should you should probably take him up on this. Like, it's not every day you get a phone call to, basically have your dream job.
Just calling you out to be the winemaker. Like you're the choice.
Yeah. I mean, and I met the owners and did the whole thing. And, but that's pretty much, what it took.
Sure.
And it was fun. I was only at Cuca Spring for a year. And it was really, again, another great learning experience. And I got to make some wines that I was really proud of and got to put my finger on. But then I wasn't even like looking, but someone had mentioned that Hillick and Hobbs was looking for an associate winemaker.
Anybody who's thinking about getting into the wine industry and is looking for a job should obviously reach out to Lynne and ask about tips on how to get jobs in the wine industry, because it can be a hard, industry to break into, but obviously you've cracked the code because everybody's just flinging jobs around.
Well, and I saw that and I was like, well, I didn't know much about the project other than that it was all Riesling. And that what I'd heard back when I moved here was Paul Hobbs put in a vineyard in the southeast side of Seneca. It's super steep and the vines are planted the wrong direction. And that's all I really knew about it.
I'm going to ask you more about the wrong direction down the line.
Yeah. And so but I knew that Paul had a reputation for quality wine. He was, he's a big name out in California, Argentina, kind of globally. And so in my mind, I was like, I just feel like we'll have a similar philosophy. And I loved the idea of focusing on the one variety. I love Riesling. Now I've been working with it for 10 years. And it's the reason I moved to the region. And as much fun as it is to like make a bunch of different wines, it's not that fulfilling to make 30 SKUs, of various different types of wines. And so anyway, so I was like, well, I'll throw my hat in the ring. Like, chances are I'm not going to get this job, but it doesn't hurt to at least like test the water. And so then, got an interview. I interviewed with his winemaking team in California. And I remember finishing that interview and thinking like, that went really well. Like, I felt like we got along really well. And then I got a second interview with them. And then next thing you know, I'm interviewing with Paul. And then they offered me the job and I like couldn't believe it. I was like, I didn't expect it to go this far. But and that really began a lot of different things, but I was excited to finally be working for a project that like I really believed in, what we were going to be doing. It was very vineyard focused, varietally focused, with only the idea of making high quality, site expressive wines. That's like the goal. And to be able to be a winemaker and be allowed for that to be the focus is very rare.
It's like the dream.
It's the dream.
People who want to make high quality wine.
Yeah. And I think, with the project too, a little less now than a couple years ago, but I have spent a lot of time in the vineyard and working closely with the vineyard team, and being able to really say that these wines are made off this vineyard, that's the sole intention, and experiencing it and knowing the quality of the fruit and that vineyard is like a very special place, and to be in it all the seasons and like going through the seasons with it, and then being able to make those picking decisions and make the wines. It's like a very holistic approach to winemaking.
Sure. Well, a couple of the other things that crossed my mind that I suspect jive with exactly what you're saying is that given the volume that you're doing, given the planting orientation, and as the website notes, makes it really hard to mechanize much vineyard work. Yeah. It's basically you and a couple people out in there doing everything with your hands, right? Yeah. These are things that are not the case at every winery. Yeah. And so you're in a situation, as I imagine it in my mind, where you are unusually close to the grapes and the site. Yeah. Which, for somebody who can appreciate it, as it sounds like you can, sounds like an ideal circumstance.
Yeah, I think, early on, especially I started in the cellar. And I think sometimes when you start going on that track, it becomes difficult to get more experience in the vineyard.
Totally.
Because
it's the circumstance that I'm in now.
Yeah.
I love what I do and I love where I work, and I feel like I have learned a lot and continue to learn a lot. And I've said it in other interviews that I know that if somebody tried to give me a job tomorrow where I both had to grow grapes and make wine, I would struggle. I mean, I would need to do a lot of catching up.
Yeah. And I feel like which is kind of, it's made the job very interesting because I'm learning a lot all the time. And it's been a very steep learning curve. But I'm, now I'm more fascinated in like plant physiology and like understanding what's happening in the vineyard, with that being the goal, that being like the base of making the wine. Like less, and like viticulture and winemaking, like, I have the textbooks, I can reference things if I have questions, I have peers. But I'm becoming a little less curious about, microbiology, than I am about like agriculture. And we have a great team that's knowledgeable and skilled, and they care a lot. And so that's helpful, when it comes to, making these wines. And I always think about it too, like, people get all excited about like, oh, the winemaker, like, oh, so special. Like, and I'm like, yeah, but it's a collaborative effort. Like, It's not just me making the wines. Like I have, I make picking decisions, and I joke that I'm a babysitter. Like I just make sure that things don't go wrong and that we're steering things in the right direction, and we're being intentional, but it starts in the vineyard, and without like the team doing that we have nothing. So like that, I mean, to me, that's more important than like, my title.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's interesting to hear you say that. This is a conversation. Well, it's a thought process that I go through a lot mentally as I view how I relate to my job in the wine world. But it's a lesson that took me a long time, or an opinion that it took me a long time to develop. My interest started in the cellar and in winemaking. Mm-hmm. And somewhere along the line, you start to realize that maybe winemaking, what you physically do with the juice and the grapes in the cellar, isn't what makes the wine, and it's actually that good wine is grown.
Yeah.
And it puts people like me who are in a situation where they're hands-on with the wine, but relatively hands-off with the grapes, which I will caveat what I'm saying, and also say that I think that's both a blessing and a curse. But to realize that a huge amount of what goes into the final wine happens in the vineyard. And I think that's almost less knowledge and more wisdom that you come across with time. And so as you're talking about your interest changing from some degree from the microbiology and the things that you think about as somebody who works full-time in a cellar, mm-hmm. to somebody who is now putting more attention on what's happening in the vineyard, to me totally makes sense. And is reflective of the way that it is, of the truth. And
I think, I just find that, when this job has given me the opportunity really to explore that. Because again, like Acuca Spring, I worked with, we had a little vineyard, and they still have a little vineyard there, but primarily we're buying fruit. And so there's a huge disconnect between, what's going on all season long, and then when the fruit arrives. I'm talking to growers a little bit here and there, and then I'm going to like look at the fruit as, we're getting close to harvest. But other than that, like they're doing all of that work. We're here, we look at our vineyard all the time. Or like, where can we make improvements? How do we make these vines healthier? How do we get better at predicting how much fruit we're going to have? There's just different challenges. And I just feel more connected. It makes me feel more connected to the wines because I'm connected to the site.
Of course.
Because the wines, I think some people, like, I can't imagine that all these Rieslings, like all these different blocks can taste differently if it's one variety and one estate, but they're all so unique. And then they're constantly trying to solve this puzzle of, but why? Like, what is it about block 8 that makes it this way? Is it the clone? Is it the location? Is it, what is it? And so just creating these new questions and problems to solve and try to understand, which is it's very intimate and fascinating.
Well, you're inadvertently transitioning perfectly into one of the handful of questions that I have written down to ask you. So on your website, which has a lot of great information, it lists, let me see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different clones of Riesling, it seems like. And it says you have 25 acres planted. And looking at the wine that you have available, it looks like you do at least one vintage Riesling. And then it looked like there was also a separate Riesling called the Lower Terrace.
Yes.
I guess I'm already getting myself off track as I'm talking through this question. What you originally started talking about, and the ultimate question that I want to ask you regarding the clones that you have in the vineyard, something that I can't help but wonder every time I talk about terroir with a winemaker is one factor that I could easily see influencing what people call terroir, or like the distinction that the site makes on the wine ultimately, that I think could easily skate under people's radar as considering or just be something that is not often talked about and hard to nail down is clone.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you have ever been put in circumstances where you ferment clones separately, and what, based on your experience, is the relationship between how clones play into how we view terroir? And here's what I'm kind of ultimately getting at. I don't think that it's the case, but I can imagine somebody making an argument claiming that terroir is entirely clonal. For example, all winemakers agree that Riesling from this vineyard and Riesling from that vineyard almost always taste different. Yeah. Unless you have weenie terroir, but I've never really ran into that. I think it would be an easy argument to say one of the obvious contenders for why these two Rieslings from these two vineyards taste separately is that they're comprised of separate clones. Yeah. And the clones have different DNA and blah, blah, blah. And so, of course, the Riesling is going to taste differently. I'm wondering, based on your experience, how does clone impact... How do you mentally categorize the distinction between clonal difference and how it relates to terroir? Yeah. I think maybe I've made a little bit of a jumble out of this question.
I hear what you're saying.
But just take the general, thinking, and please expound based on your experience.
I think that's something that we're still trying to figure out, because I think right now, when I look at the wines that we have in the cellar, I'm thinking about them more on the location of the block and less about the clone. Mm-hmm.
We think about them the same way. Like as we go up the hill where we have our Riesling, we experience differences.
And sometimes block side by side. What's interesting is so we have Lower Terrace. It's a single block, single 50 or 500 liter punch-in wine ferment. We sold out last summer, but we had North Ravine, which also single block, right next to Lower Terrace, separate ferment in a barrel. They're the same clone, two different rootstocks, completely different wines.
Oh, this is exactly the kind of experience that I'm hoping to hear about.
Yeah. So, and now we did that in 2022, 2023, and now, I've got wines, they're finally done fermenting, from 2024. And every year, those two blocks, they are distinct from one another. They carry the same character year after year, even if there's some different profile, because the growing seasons are different. The character of the wine, the base of it, is very similar year after year, in terms of their flavor profiles and structure. So, and to me, that's more interesting. And than the clones. Now I do eventually, and like I want to spend a little bit more time classifying, like actually sitting down with all the lots I have that are 239. And there's not much, but like, and just being like, is there something, what are the similarities? Can I find them? Which is hard to do because you're setting yourself up to try to find the similarities versus it being objective. But it's something that, you know, as the vines get a little older, can I see those similarities from those clone selections? You know, but right now when I look at it, it's like I'm seeing that all these different blocks are unique, and some of them are the same clones and some of them are different. Most of the vineyard is 198 and 239 with small plantings of the other clones. But again, it's like the location in the vineyard makes the biggest impact is what I'm finding. And again, it's, you know, I think we just did this event in our tasting room where people got to taste through some of our 24 ferments, and they could not believe how different they all were.
Interesting.
Because again, it's one variety, one site, but one block next to the other, completely different wines.
Super interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that's a relief in some ways. I mean, based on experience and talking with other winemakers about their experience, like we're doing, you know, I would be stunned if anybody could come up with the chemistry of terroir, you know, why it makes a difference and all that. But, you know, I expect in reality, the matrix of factors that go into why a wine tastes the way that it does is so complex that's the reason why Riesling from here and Riesling from there tastes different. You know, I mean, between where the vineyard is, the slope, the soil type, the clone type, the microclimates of the, you know, different environments, how they're treated in the cellar. I mean, there's like, you could go on and make a huge list of factors that could influence the direction of any specific wine. And I think most people think like that's what's beautiful about it. You know, that's why you can have X wineries in the Finger Lakes making Riesling and have them all be special and valid because they're all special. Yeah. I mean, and not just from like a, you know, it's special kind of way, but like they're distinct. Yeah, they're distinct. And I mean, I think that's what makes Riesling one of the greatest varieties and why I gravitated towards it working in Oregon. I mean, I think part of it was everyone was making so much Pinot. And I was like, I love Pinot, but I was getting pretty tired of it when I was out there. I was like, anything else, somebody. You know, it's so funny to hear you say some of these things because your draw to Riesling and away from Pinot is something that is like ideal candidate Finger Lakes winemaker opinion because we struggle to, you know, Pinot doesn't love it so much here. People do it and it can taste good, but you know, it's a good thing it's not the love of your life because you would be hard pressed to find a Pinot only winery here. And I love Pinot, and when I go back to Oregon and taste the Pinots, they're lovely and I enjoy them. I love to drink them. But when I was living there, I was like, please just somebody make, and now Chardonnay is big, but at the time Chardonnay still wasn't really like a major variety. But what I found, you know, we had 3 different vineyards that my boss owned and farmed, and, you know, this is in Oregon, and the Rieslings from those 3 sites couldn't have been more different, but expressive. And again, it's, you know, the repeatability of like your study in a way. Like every year we find that these wines have this kind of character, and you know, was what we kind of can expect. And we used to do a dry and an off dry from these different sites, and you know, it's just, to me, I just like was fascinated by that, and also just the brightness. And I think I always just loved acid. And so it's like, I always like, the Rieslings are so fresh and they're like electric. And so I was really attracted to that. And, you know, and I find the same thing in the Finger Lakes, like there's so much distinction between like our site and, you know, Limestone Springs. There's just like those 2 vineyards produce very different styles of wines, but same region, same lake. But again, different microclimates, being you guys are
further north and more further south.
Sure.
Exposures, lots of things. But
some of the clones could even be the same.
Some of them could be the same, but their wines are going to be very different.
So different.
Yeah.
Interesting. Something that I have wondered as I've tasted through different wines from different places is I kind of have this feeling that certain varieties are better translators of terroir, or like middlemen that explain and make more obvious the influence of the terroir from the different sites. Yep. Gewurz is one that comes to mind for whatever reason, that some Gewurz, if even just from the small sampling that are available in the Finger Lakes, can be so distinct from one another. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, do you have feelings on that? Do you feel like some are better at translating, or maybe translating is the right word, like making distinct the terroir varieties of grapes than others, or not? Feel free to disagree with me.
Yeah, I don't know. It's so hard to say because I haven't worked with, every variety.
I apologize. I didn't think about the fact that I was asking a Riesling only winemaker to talk about not Riesling.
I do think that some are more transparent than others. Like I would say, for example, Sauvignon Blanc, the varietal character is distinct. And, there's different versions of it depending on, where it's grown. But for the most part, there's a Sauv, we call things like Sauv Blanc-y. It's a descriptor. Sure. I'm like, oh, this Riesling's kind of Sauv Blanc-y. Yeah. But it still does, I think, show, it has, vineyard character as well. But I think that in some cases, the first thing I'm like, oh, Sauv Blanc.
Interesting.
But so I just think, Riesling, Pinot Noir, these are pretty transparent. These are very transparent from the place that it's grown. Mm-hmm. And I think Sauv Blanc is too, but I on a different scale, a different level.
Yeah. On the other end of the spectrum, I'm just trying to think of things that also break my rule about varieties being better or worse at translating terroir, like something like native and hybrid grapes, for example, I think have such definite, strong varietal character.
Exactly.
That maybe they're a good example of varieties that don't translate terroir as well.
Yeah, because
imagine if people would eat Concord jelly and they were like, this definitely came from the North Ravine block.
So I think I think that they all, and because again, terroir is not just the soil; it's the climate, it's everything. So I think you can't get away from it in any variety. But I do think that some are just a little more distinct than others.
Totally.
Not to play favorites, but I guess I have one. So,
well, I don't blame you. I think a lot of Finger Lakes winemakers love Riesling.
Yeah. How can you not really?
Would you please, something else that I'm really interested to hear what you have to say, because you're one of the only people I think in the region that can have perspective on this, is about the vineyard at Hillick and Hobbs. The fact that for people who aren't aware, most all vineyards in the Finger Lakes are planted north-south, whereas the Hillick and Hobbs vineyard is planted west-east, which if you look at it, it runs, what's the opposite parallel? Perpendicular with the lake. So if you're in the tasting room, you look down through the rows, which is, it looks gorgeous to see. It's very attractive. But, and as somebody who already in this podcast has talked about how they're not a vineyard person, I don't know a lot of the pros and cons of one versus the other. I can make some up, but I'm wondering, based on your experience, what would your concerns have been before? What are your experiences with dealing with this vineyard now, both logistically and also from a winemaker? What do you think the benefits are? Tell me all the things.
Well, I think a lot of it really has to do with what's, I think, best for the vineyard on a slope that's that steep. So there's a couple things that we worry about in the Finger Lakes, right? So spring frost can be a big issue. And because we're on basically a convex hill, there's no low spots in the vineyard. So there's nowhere for cold air to settle. And
which is what you want.
Which is,
because the cold air kind of drains off.
Yeah, you want it to drain off. So, and because in cold air is heavier than warm air. And so it's constantly
moves like liquid.
Yeah. So it's constantly falling and there's nowhere in the vineyard for it to get stuck. And so it's just falling down to the lake, which is warmer, and that the lake is then warming the air and that's coming back and the warm air is rising and then the cold air, it's just constantly cycling. And so we don't have as much concern when it comes to spring frost, because the way that the vineyard is designed, we're less susceptible to damage. So for example, in 2023, there was the freeze in May that damaged a lot of people's vineyards. People had upwards of 50% plus damage from that freeze. We saw less than 10%.
Wow.
And kind of isolated in one block that is a little like flatter at the top. But, so that's a huge benefit. Another benefit to having the rows perpendicular to the lake is airflow in general. So, it's windy down on the southeast side. The winds typically come from the west. So we have air moving through the canopies. And, if you're running north-south, you kind of have like canopies almost like not like stacked one in front of the other. And so like one is inevitably acting as a bit of a windbreak to the next, where this way there's nothing blocking the wind from moving through the vineyard. And so we're able to, even on like in wet, humid weather, we're able to dry out the canopies really quickly, and that decreases our disease pressure.
Interesting. That's a consideration I had not made, but that is a very attractive idea, knowing that some of the issues that I think a lot of people in the wine industry and the Finger Lakes deal with are moisture and disease pressure related.
Yeah. And also if you're on a slope in particular, like on the flat, so the reason why most people plant north-south, the idea is you get morning and afternoon sunlight on the fruit. So you're trying to capitalize on that sun exposure. Which that makes total sense. We're in a cool climate. You're trying to get as ripe as you possibly can, getting as much sun as you can. But we're southwest facing and we get a lot of heat. So we're ripening, I wouldn't say regardless, like this is Finger Lakes. So we can have challenging falls, but for the most part, we're probably one of the warmest sites on Seneca Lake. So we're able to get that extra, just from the aspect, get that extra warmth. But also when you're driving a tractor on those north-south facing or directional rows on a hill, you're inevitably making these little terraces because the tractors are digging into the hillside to go through the vineyard. And now you're creating low spots for cold air to constantly be settling as well.
Interesting.
And this way we don't have that because our tractors are going down the hill and up the hill. But we have to use tractors, which are basically like little bulldozers to go to operate in the vineyard.
Like tractors with like tank tracks?
Like metal tracks versus wheels.
Interesting.
So the weight's more evenly distributed along the tractor and it gets better grip on the slopes.
Sounds fun.
I don't know if our vineyard manager would say that, but they work very well and we have very narrow rows. So it's not like the most fun, but it does work.
Okay, interesting. So you can mechanize some of the vineyard work.
Well, we have to spray and mow. Yeah. So those are the two main things that we use the tractors for.
Okay.
But again, we can spray a lot less than most people. I think on average, people spray like 12 times or more. Last year we sprayed 8 times. Wow. So
do you think that has to do with the what you mentioned before, the drainage of the air because of the directionality of the rows?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It makes a huge impact on disease pressure.
Are there any negatives to consider if somebody were considering doing this? I know one of the big ones that people always like to mention when you talk about planting this way is the potential for erosion.
Yeah, yeah.
Because you don't have the breaks, like you were mentioning, each row when it's planted north-south kind of acts as its own break to stop things from eroding. Yeah. Whereas you can imagine like a straight shot water from west to south because it's on this slope.
Yeah, you have to be very calculated, which I think that, when they first planted to now, like we've very good systems in place. So we don't till anything. We don't use herbicides. So everything's undercover all the time. So we don't have very much topsoil to begin with. So we'd like to keep it, what we do have on the hill. So we're very invested in that. So it's a little more work. We had to, get a specialized, we call it Clemens Multi-Clean to mow under the rows. And then we have intricate draining systems that, if we were to get a ton of water, on the property, it basically drains into like a retention pond. But we are very careful.
Like underground tile draining?
Yeah. There's drain tiles. But then also if you're like one of the upper terraces, drains down to a laneway that is sloped, that's pitched south, then that drains into a retention pond. Okay. So that the direction of the slope aids in capturing the water.
Interesting.
But because we don't, we have so much grass and plant life, it's not really an issue. If the only issue is really the driveway, and that's just gravel kind of moving out of the way.
Oh, eroding.
Yeah, it doesn't really like a road, but it definitely gravel moves around the driveway.
That always makes those like little pits that just get worse over time.
Yeah. But yeah, so it's been well thought out. How do we prevent erosion? And even when, we still have to plant vineyard, like there's times where we do have to expose the soil, but the work's done, it's seeded and strawed immediately. So then, and the straw helps keep the soil in place.
Down.
And then we have, the cover crop starts growing almost immediately.
Interesting.
So, but we don't need to do that very often. And we do it in really small sections if we ever have to. I don't think we plant more than a couple acres at a time. So yeah, we're very careful about that. But erosion is an issue, and it has been an issue for that site in the past. But now we've kind of had the systems in place that prevent that.
Sure. Interesting. At this point, I know that you're making still Riesling. We just talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
Do I remember a conversation that we had where you said that maybe you were starting to make sparkling Riesling as well?
Yeah. So in 2024, we made our first pick for sparkling. So that's getting bottled in a month from now. And then, then we wait. We still don't know, exactly what the plan is for release date or how long it's going to be on tirage, but that'll basically be decided by tasting the wine. But I'm really excited. I love sparkling wine. It's one of my favorite things to consume. And for us, I think expanding the portfolio, the different expressions of Riesling is really going to tie things together.
Sure. How did you determine what block, as we were talking about vineyard blocks or blocks, what selection? Well, maybe first let me ask, because I guess it's part of the same question. I assume that you picked it a little early, as is common for sparkling wine. Yes. So you have higher acidity, lower sugar. And then, imagine you have to make that call to pick something early. How do you choose which grapes to pick?
Yeah. So this year, and this is our first time making sparkling off this site. So, that was a question. But for some reason it seemed pretty straightforward. So we picked this block called E1. It's at the top of the property, close to the driveway. And it tends to always have quite a bit of, it's kind of it can be an early ripening block, but it always has a lot of acidity. So we're able to get it pretty ripe but also be really fresh. And so I kind of figured it was a safe bet for picking for sparkling. Like we weren't gonna miss it. The acid's gonna be there, the freshness is gonna be there.
Sure.
And it's beautiful. And we fermented it natively, that was my first time doing a sparkling base wine native. Because normally, you're desperate. You want your sparkling wine to finish to 0 grams of sugar.
Absolutely.
And so the easy way to guarantee that, you throw yeast into it and just get it there. So this is my first time not doing that and practicing a large amount of patience.
Gutsy choice.
Yeah. It's gutsy, but people do it.
And probably the low pH too would psych some people out.
Yeah, exactly. Like the yeast don't necessarily want to survive, but I don't know what the native thing is going on at Hillick and Hobbs, but it ferments.
It pumps.
It does. It does not move fast. It's very slow, but it always finishes.
And no problem getting to the end.
Mm-mm. Yeah. I mean, I always personally wanted to get there faster, but
of course,
but it does get there.
Well, we had a situation in the winery this past year at Ravines where we had a couple tanks. We inoculate everything, and the normal schedule that we follow, things should be done in a month's time or so. Like total zero, things slow down at the end. And we had a couple of things that were taking longer than usual, and when we're kind of in our own bubble there because 90+% of things wrap up easy peasy, no intervention required. And then when we have things that are stragglers, it's like, oh God, and then I think at one point you had come to the cellar and you said that you still had fermentations going. And I was like, thank God, I need outside perspective of people, especially people who are using native fermentations that often require more time to finish to help be perspective. And be
I still have wines fermenting.
Yeah, it may be January, but everybody's going to live.
Yeah, and I had to talk myself off that ledge.
You still have fermentations going? Is that what you just said?
I'm hoping most of them are done by Monday. But
what's the date? It's February 22nd or something like that?
Yeah.
23rd.
Yeah. But every year in January, I have this little crisis of, the wines, why aren't they done? Like we're still so far away from the finish line. And then I'm like, this happens every year, and every year they finish, but sometimes a heat belt has to be used, and but it's normally I'd like to be done. I'd love to be done, by January, but typically it's more around this time that where things are wrapping up.
Sure.
Which is, and it kind of is what it is. And the wines have worked out very well that way. So, I might in the future, we've talked about like experimenting with temperature and seeing if that just like helps at all. But part of me is not super inclined because I kind of like the way the wines turn out.
Changing the fermentation temperature? Yeah,
like warming it up a little bit. We don't ferment that cold, but it like globally, I think it would be cold. Like we ferment like 58, 60 degrees.
Okay.
But
I would think that's pretty cold for native. That's about what we ferment at. And then when we get to the last like quarter or so of fermentation, maybe even less, we turn off the cooling and it will warm up. Sometimes I've seen 65, 67 to try and give it a little bit more momentum to get to the end.
Yeah.
I think Taylor, when I spoke with Taylor, I think she fermented even colder. I think she was maybe like down to 56 or something.
Yeah. I mean, it's, I think with yeast, that's like, I think you can play a little bit more in like colder.
Totally.
But we fermented them, I've been around 56, 58 degrees. But they go, but they're never like rearing.
Sure.
Like nothing ever really gets away from me.
Remind me, at this point, are you all native fermentation?
Yeah. Since when I started in 2021, we were all native.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Something winemakery that I really want to ask you as we're talking about it. This was something that I warned you that I was going to ask about you when I saw you in the cellar. And I've been thinking about it for a long time. And so I'm excited to get in your brain about it. Something that it sounds like you do that is uncommon is that you do some fermentations on the full press lees.
Yeah. We rack, but we take almost everything with us.
Okay. So let me just define a little for anybody who's listening and maybe doesn't know what I'm talking about. Normally, the protocol for after you press juice is you let it settle, and a lot of like little bits of organic matter and grape skins come with the juice from the press, and it's cloudy. And those bits over 24 or so hours will settle to the bottom of the tank, and then people take what is ostensibly like crystal clear juice a lot of the time off the top, and that's what they end up fermenting. I was always under the impression that people did that. That was the protocol because, yeast, when they're doing their job, like some solids, but not a lot of solids, and that you run the risk potentially of putting the yeast in an environment where they're unhappy. I don't know exactly why or what the science is. Maybe somebody who does know can email me and we'll learn about it. And so that was the danger. So I guess, why don't you just tell me some of your experience? So instead of racking totally clear, you will rack like normal, but then you'll keep going and you'll suck some of those solids back up.
Yeah, we take most of them. I like in 2021 is a little more like distinct because sometimes with you want the lees to be healthy and clean. So like anything, smelling them and checking them out and making
like if there was some rot or something, you wouldn't take that.
Yeah, if there was a lot of botrytis or something and the lees were a little funky, I'll leave it. But for the most part, which that's such a rarity. Like that rarely happens. Mostly we just take them all.
It's so funny because normally when we talk about healthy lees, they're fermentation lees, which is my understanding primarily, I guess it has to be the case, primarily composed of yeast because you've taken away a lot of that organic matter at the time that the fermentation is over.
Yeah.
And so it's funny to talk about healthy press lees because normally, like in my world, we don't discuss them. They go down the drain.
They go away.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think too, one of the, there's a lot of reasons why I think people want more clarified juice. Again, it's like you're eliminating risk a little bit. You don't know what microorganisms are in if there's spoilage organisms or something in the lees, you're kind of eliminating that. And also I've always found, and this is how I think about it, that lees is like an oxygen scavenger. So, and yeast need oxygen. They like to have some oxygen. So I think that's like another thing. It's a slightly, I think in some ways, a more hostile environment. But at the same time, I think for me, some of those microorganisms are good. I think that's why part of the reason why native ferments for us are actually quite easy because we have a lot of life in the juice when it's coming in.
That is interesting to consider that you could ostensibly be it could be a good source of inoculating native yeast.
Yeah, there's just a lot of, again, it's microorganisms living in the lees. But we do a lot to build texture in the wines and I've always loved it. The first time I experimented where I actually did not rack at all and I fermented on press lees, I ended up really loving the wine. It was very reductive and I had to rack it off with 2 bricks to go because it was
getting a little stinky.
And the lees, by the time we racked it off, I thought a propane tank was leaking in the cellar because it smelled so bad.
Jesus.
The wine was fine, but the lees were very reductive. I like that reductive environment. It feels very safe when you're fermenting native in a way and things are going for a long time. We don't use any sulfur until, we add a little bit at after fermentation and then a little bit before bottling. But so I think in some way, in my mind, whether this is scientific or not, it feels like they're helping protect the wine too.
Sure. I'm sure that they are in the way that lees do.
Yeah. But yeah.
So you mentioned you hope for some addition to the structure as a reason why you might include the heavy solids.
Yeah.
Is that through extraction through the solids? I mean, how
I think
in your mind do you think that
consistently
works?
suspend. It's like this because during fermentation, it's so funny because I feel like our wines mid to peak fermentation look like hazy IPAs. They're just sort of the color is weird and they're super cloudy. And I think that constant suspension, I guess extraction's one word, or kind of the breakdown of the lees over time, kind of becoming a part of the wine. And it just adds a lot of texture, and kind of a broadness to this, typically a wine a variety that can be quite sharp and linear.
Interesting. The thing that goes through my mind is there's this technique that I'm sure you've heard of that when I interviewed Taylor, we discussed for a minute, which was, it's called stabulation. And it's the process of keeping the press lees, like we're talking about, in the juice, but pre-fermentation and stopping fermentation by cooling down the juice and maybe adding sulfur such that spontaneous fermentation doesn't want to naturally start.
Yeah.
And stirring the press lees through bubbling or whatever in hopes that you'll extract some, goodies from the organic matter that you have in, which to me is kind of akin, like it seems maybe not very popular. It's a not uncommon technique with some white wines in the Finger Lakes region for people to do skin contact for a really short time pre-fermentation, like a day or less, overnight maybe. And we've done that with some wines at Ravines. I've done it with some of my own wines. I know some other colleagues who have done it, and it definitely has an impact because you get some extraction from the skins, and it affects the texture, it affects the aroma. And part of me can't help but feel like that mechanism to some degree must be going on in these fermentations. And that makes a lot of sense to me. Kind of, this is outside of what's going on with the yeast because that I know way less about and can't possibly comment on or begin to speculate on, what the yeast are doing differently in this environment. But that certainly seemed... I would think is part of the stylistic impact that this technique has on the wine. And I think that it's super interesting.
Yeah. And I don't know why people, I mean, I guess I do know why people are like afraid of like heavy solid ferments, but I love them. I
think if I had to guess, I'm totally biased because I've had few experiences. I've been working at Ravines a long time, but I think I can imagine a world where somebody tries to experiment with this and that wine maybe gets slightly stinkier or stinkier slightly faster than another tank. And they just say to themselves, well, that's all I needed to see.
Yeah.
It's like it wants to be a little problem child because it's got some extra solids in it. And so we're foregoing this technique.
Yeah.
But ultimately, if I can just also caveat that at the same time and fight for why I think what you're doing is interesting and a good idea, the point isn't for wines to get not stinky. I mean, fermentations get reductive all the time, and whether it just needs some air or a little nutrients or whatever, depends on who you are, where you are, and what the problem is. You can clean it up and fix that problem. And the question is the finished wine good? Not, did it make my job harder because I need to pay extra attention to it?
Well, and that's the thing. It's so funny because I don't find that our wines, they're always they're like in this current stage, there's a fine like line of reduction, but it's not crazy. And they never really get like overtly stinky, which I find interesting because we are fermenting on heavy lees. We're doing native ferments, we do use nutrients. But it's bizarre that I don't find that the wines ever get like crazy reductive.
Sure.
Like it's just like, oh, that's a little reductive.
Well, I'll say this. First, I'll immediately caveat it by saying, I have not tasted enough Hillick and Hobbs wines to be able to say definitively this is my experience, and based on the way that I view reduction, this is the way that it is. Based on the handful of times that I've had Hillick and Hobbs wine, which is 4 or 5, which is a decent sample size, the wines are like don't show in the way that I would call reductive.
No,
to me, reductive is like the varietal character is stepped on by this stinky cabbagey reduction.
Yeah.
And there could be a beautiful wine in there, but the reduction is in the way.
Yeah.
Where certainly it's a spectrum, and a reductive wine can just show, maybe slightly tight, needs decanting, or something like that, or a couple extra swirls in the glass when you pour it. But those wines, are so debatably reductive by the time that they're at that point.
Yeah.
That if you said to me, part of the problem is that or part of my experience with dealing with this is that I occasionally deal with reduction, I feel like I could say wholeheartedly, well, the good news is the wine doesn't show particularly reductive. So,
I know sometimes I wish they would show a little more, but,
well, I was expecting this to be like almost a more tumultuous conversation because we've tasted reductive wines together that are not yours and not mine, but just like in general. And you have said that you like reduction. I'm always like, this lady it drives me crazy.
Well,
because my personal preference is slightly less.
Yeah, our 2023 has a little bit more, which I love, and so like I was pretty happy with that. And again, it's something like, and it's not a target. It's just like sometimes they are a little bit more, but I like them like right now, you know, in this stage, like, you know, just post fermentation, they're always a little bit reductive in like those qualities I really like. But they're typically transient. So like as soon as because we don't rack until before bottling. And so like once the wine starts moving, a lot of those transitory reductive aromas tend to kind of go away. But we're really careful, like, you know, we like we measure DO, you know, we're not trying to get a lot of oxygen in the wines, but it's just inevitably you move it off the lees and you get a little bit of a different polish to it. But I do
it's amazing what moving wine off the lees will do.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a really transformative experience to taste a wine and maybe have it be a little stinky, and then you move it once and then a week later, maybe so that the DO settles or whatever, it's a totally different wine.
Yeah. So yeah. And like and for me, I'm always, because I don't know how you capture reduction in a way that, like, I don't think you can, for me, I haven't figured out a way that, like, how do I control it? Where it's like, I want that little bit, but not too much or not the wrong kind.
Sure.
I don't know if there's a method to that, but
to like actually get it into the bottle such that it gets to the consumer's mouth the way that you want it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think the 2023 is very close to that. Like it's just this nice little hint that you're like, oh, like there's, what is that interesting aroma? And then you move straight into the other parts of the wine, but it's like there and it's interesting.
I think I have a bottle of 23 in the cellar. I'll have to open it and taste it.
Yeah. I love that wine. That's out of the ones, I mean, they're all their own, you know, special stars, but I think I'm very excited about the 23 compared to the year. And it's also, I just love the vintages like 2023 as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. I just have a couple more questions to ask you. This one, well, I'll just see what your opinion is. On the website, it says that the Hillick and Hobbs winery was founded with the vision to create Riesling that rivals its European brethren by pushing the boundaries of modern viticulture. What I'm wondering, which I guess is just a philosophical question.
Yeah. Well, you did study philosophy, so.
Oh, did I already?
No, I said you did study philosophy.
Oh, I did.
Yeah.
Philosophically, when you categorize or compare Finger Lakes Rieslings as a thing and European Rieslings as a thing, do you think that they compare as apples to oranges? Or how do you, I thought it was an interesting quote that is related to your place of work. This isn't your quote. Yeah. But I thought it was an interesting question. And maybe I should, I'll add this small story, which as a caveat, which is something why I think that this topic is an interesting one. I tasted a Riesling from the 80s. I think it was from somewhere in Austria. And it was to this day the best wine that I've ever tasted. I mean, if there was a wine that tasted like rainbows and happy dreams, and it was this wine. I mean, it had the most depth, and it was so floral, and it was just like perfect. It had acid. It was slightly off dry. It was just like the best wine that I had ever tasted. And I said something to somebody who I respect a lot about, you know, I had never tasted a Riesling from that compared to this. And, you know, I asked him about how Riesling from the Finger Lakes compares and stuff. And we just had an interesting conversation about based on the differences in regions, like can you compare them essentially? Because certainly they both produce quality Rieslings, but are they so distinct that they can be compared is kind of what I'm getting at.
I think, I don't know if you can like compare like the specific character of the wines from the region. I think that like each place, like we have similar soils to the Mosel in Germany, but we're not the Mosel in Germany. Like our climates are different, our seasons are different, what we experience is different. Their vineyards are much older. So I think like the wines inevitably are different.
Of course.
But I think that you can compare from complexity, like intrigue, like the quality of the wines. Like I think those things are comparable, and like and it's a little subjective because like my idea of, you know, my rainbows and unicorns Riesling could be different than yours,
Of course.
but I think that, you know, you can look for like, but I don't know. I think you can use that as like a comparative structure. I don't really know what I'm trying to say, but like looking at the complexity and interest of the wine and comparing it to places that have been doing this for a really long time and have a good reputation for making these high quality, like interesting Rieslings. And like, can we do that too? And I do think we can. They're going to be different, but I think that they can have the same type of power that, you know, another region has.
I suppose that's ultimately what I was getting at.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that equally, because I mean, you know, in Germany and Austria, they're not the only places growing Riesling. There are other Australia, there's, you know, places in Chile, like there's Rieslings being grown around the world.
Totally.
But, you know, I think Austria and Germany has been the benchmark because they've been doing it for hundreds of years. And
totally.
And I've had Rieslings that, you know, rival the best white Burgundies I've had. You know, like they're complex and flinty and stony and chalky, but then there's fruit and there's texture and there's just like so many layers, you know, and I think, you know, we can do that here. I don't know if we're there yet, but I think it's possible.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, we love a hopeful message.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, I've only been at Hillick and Hobbs for under 4 years. And so, my old boss in Oregon used to do this. He's like, I won't know how to make Rieslings from these vineyards in my lifetime. And my kids may not figure out the best way to make these wines.
Jesus, I don't care to think like that.
Yeah, so it's like we're a part of like a bigger, longer journey. And so like, I'm just learning about this vineyard. This vineyard is new. And then the next person is going to take that to like the next level.
Interesting.
And we're going to be able to be better at what we're doing from time and understanding.
Yeah.
And I think, again, Europe definitely has a jump start on us.
Of course.
You know, they've got generations of winemakers and generations of vineyard people that really know those sites. And they're still making new discoveries, I'm sure, every year. But again, they just have a bit more of a backlog of information than we do.
Yeah, totally. There are a number of things that makes us distinct, and absolutely one of them is the history, or in some ways lack thereof, depending on like how deep you look into history. Okay, so the last thing that I'll ask you is, what will you drink for dinner tonight? This is my wrap-up question. So whether it's tonight or on average, we were just talking about what we did with our weekends and stuff like that. So on average, what are you drinking with dinner? Water or beer?
Sometimes beer. I'm chronically dehydrated. It's almost a joke. It depends. Like I think right now, like depending on the season, like right now I love grabbing a bottle of red wine from the cellar. But it depends on me. Like again, I love to grab a bottle of Pinot
from your cellar.
Yeah, from my basement.
Like your collection, yeah.
My little collection. So if I have a Pinot, sometimes that, sparks my interest. Or the other night I opened up a red wine from Mount Etna in Italy, and but right now it's like I like a kind of a fresh red in the wintertime.
That sounds great.
Yeah. I need to be better about organizing my cellar. I don't even really know what's down there. So I basically I browse the collection and I see what inspires me.
I literally just today put some washer in the laundry and walked by my wine collection and saw some old magnums from of Riesling from a Finger Lakes producer. And I was like, oh my God, I totally forgot that I had those. And they're from like 2014.
That's great.
And I was like, man, I really need to find an opportunity to drink this. is.
I know, and it is like fun to like go because I've been buying wine for years and things come and go from the cellar, and sometimes I forget that I buy something or I bought it and the moment wasn't right until then to drink it. But right now I think like when I'm down there perusing, I'm looking for like kind of fresh reds for the wintertime.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah.
I just remembered what I was going to say before, which was not a question, but an invitation to say that after we discussed, Lynne's winemaking style and the way that Finger Lakes Rieslings relate to Rieslings from the rest of the world, it felt like a perfect opportunity to say people should buy some Hillick and Hobbs Riesling and taste it and compare. Email me and let me know. Let Lynne know how awesome the wine is. And I guess that was just that.
Yeah, no, everyone, I think I think that it's a great tool. I like sometimes we've done this before. We've thrown our wine in with other producers' wines and tasted it blind just to give us.
It's important to do, I would say.
I think it's helpful because when you do it like that, you might pick up something that you didn't before, and also be like, okay, what about this specific wine? Even if it's not my own, why am I so interested in it? Like, what are these characters that I'm finding, and is that something that's possible with the wines that we're making?
In my experience, blind tasting like that is single-handedly one of the most educational opportunities that you can have insofar as developing your palate and your opinion are concerned once you de-blind them and, surprise yourself at what's going on and stuff like that. And especially to do it with other people and to realize how varied people's opinions are or
how little we know.
Yeah. It was one of the big reliefs in my time that if I like to tell this to people who, sometimes, especially I think as a wine professional, you have tastings with people and they'll be the first ones to want to tell you that they're inexperienced and that they don't have a lot of confidence in their ability to taste. And the thing that I always tell people in that circumstance is the tasting groups that we have had and you've been in on, and it's all winemakers and other wine professionals. And one of the first things that we do is just a thumbs up or a thumbs down after we taste a wine to see who likes it and who doesn't like it. And 90% of the time, it's like at least 60-40 or something like that split down the room, which is just to say that wine is subjective and you should like what you drink.
Exactly. Period.
And don't listen to anybody else. It reminds me of that scene from some show where they were at this wine tasting and the guy goes, "Are you tasting the melon?" And the ladies go, "Yeah." And she says, "And I'm thinking, I think I'm tasting some rose." And the guy goes, "No, you're not." Anyway. Well, thank you so much for letting me take up an hour and a half of your life. This was super great. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, John. This is fun.
Thank you all so much for listening. I'm thrilled you could make it to the end of the podcast. If you have any thoughts on questions you'd like me to ask or comments about your experience, I'd love to hear them. Please don't hesitate to email me at eastcoastwinemaking@gmail.com. Until next time, I hope you all have a wonderful day.